The heartbeat of a localized world is measured in revolutions per minute. Down here, 3 decks below the waterline, the world did not care about politics, weather, or the passage of time. It only cared about compression, ignition, and exhaust. I wiped a smear of heavy fuel oil from the brass housing of the number 3 injector pump. The rag was already black, saturated with the lifeblood of the SS Iron Range. Around me, the ship's main engine, a massive 2-story Sulzer diesel, thrummed with a rhythm that I felt in the soles of my boots rather than heard with my ears. It was a physical pressure, a constant, rhythmic geological event contained within steel walls. My name is Kalen Thorne. I'm the 2nd engineer on this rust bucket, and I understand the language of thermal efficiency better than I understand most human conversation. The air in the engine room was thick, a hot soup of atomized oil, ozone, and the metallic tang of heated steel. It was 110 degrees down here, even though the hull plating a few feet away was pressing against the freezing slush of Lake Superior. I checked the pyrometers on the cylinder heads. Cylinder 5 was running 20 degrees hot. Not critical, but it was an itch in my brain. A fuel rack sticking, maybe, or a worn nozzle tip. I pulled a wrench from my back pocket, a heavy, drop-forged adjustable spanner that had been part of my hand for 15 years. I tapped the fuel rack linkage. The vibration traveled up the tool and into my arm. A solid, reassuring resonance. The needle on the gauge flickered and settled back into the green. Mechanical problems are honest. If a bearing fails, it's because of friction or fatigue. It does not lie to you. It does not panic. It just obeys the laws of physics until it can't anymore. I was moving toward the purifier room to check the sludge discharge when the rhythm changed. It was not a sound at first. It was a shift in gravity. The deck tilted almost imperceptibly forward, and the deep, chest-thumping bass of the main engine faltered. The turbochargers, usually screaming a high-pitched whine that drilled into your skull, began to spool down. The pitch dropped, sliding from a shriek to a groan. Then the telegraph rang. It was not a digital beep. On the Iron Range, the telegraph was an old-school electromechanical unit. The bell struck with a sharp, percussive violence that cut through the roar of the machinery. Ding, ding, ding. I looked up at the repeater on the console. The illuminated arrow swung from full ahead past stop and locked onto emergency full astern. My stomach dropped. You do not reverse a 30,000-ton ore carrier loaded with taconite pellets unless you are about to hit something hard, or you have already hit it. The entire ship shuddered. The massive propeller shaft, a rod of steel 2 feet thick running the length of the tunnel, fought against the momentum of the water. The main bearings screamed in protest, a grinding, high-frequency vibration that made the grating under my feet rattle against the support beams. I grabbed the handrail of the central control console. The phone on the bulkhead buzzed, a harsh, jagged sound. I snatched the receiver. "Engine room," I said. My voice was flat, professional. "Thorne, kill the mains. Kill them now." It was the chief engineer. He sounded breathless, his voice cracking with a hysteria that did not belong on a commercial vessel. "Chief, we're in a crash-stop maneuver. If I kill the mains now, we lose steerage. We drift." "We're grounding her!" he screamed. The distortion on the line turned his voice into a static-filled bark. "Ram it into the shoals! Just stop the damn prop before it sucks them in!" Sucks them in? "Chief, clarify," I said, my eyes scanning the gauges. Oil pressure was spiking on the reduction gear. "The ice! They're on the ice! Just kill it, Kalen! I'm sealing the ECR." The line went dead. I looked at the telegraph. It was still demanding reverse thrust. I looked at the oil pressure. I looked at the tachometer. The ship was shaking violently now, a seizure of steel and rivets as the hull ground against something solid. A terrible, groaning screech echoed through the double-bottomed tanks, the sound of steel plates buckling under immense friction. The iron range had stopped. I did not kill the engine. I brought it to idle. Old habits die hard. You do not murder a running diesel unless the crankcase is about to explode. I declutched the shaft, letting the propeller spin free, and the engine settled into a loping, uneven idle. I grabbed my hard hat and my heavy canvas coat from the hook by the watertight door. I needed to see the sky. The climb up the central casing was a journey through climate zones. I ascended the steel gratings, hand over hand on the oily railings. Level 1, searing heat. Level 2, the air grew cooler, smelling of galley grease and diesel. Level 3, the accommodation block. Here, the air was frigid. The ship's heating system was struggling against the intrusion of the superior winter. I stepped out of the fiddly hatch onto the main weather deck, and the cold hit me like a physical blow. It was a dry, biting freeze that instantly stiffened the moisture in my nostrils. The sky was a bruised purple, heavy with snow that had not fallen yet. We were close to shore. Too close. The massive concrete structure of the Marquette ore dock loomed off the port bow, maybe 300 yards away. But we had not docked. We had run aground on a sandbar just shy of the breakwall. The lake was wrong. Usually, this time of year, the water is a churning black soup of slush and pancake ice. But the temperature had plummeted so fast that the surface was locking up before my eyes. A sheet of gray, jagged ice stretched from the shoreline out to our hull, solidifying in the unnatural calm. And on that ice, people were running. I pulled a pair of heavy leather work gloves from my coat pocket and walked to the port rail. The metal was covered in a thin veneer of rime ice, slick and deadly. I gripped the rail and squinted against the wind. There were dozens of them, maybe 100. They were sprinting from the shoreline, scrambling over the pressure ridges of the ice shelf. They did not move like dock workers or distressed sailors. They moved with a fluid, terrifying kinetic energy. They were flinging themselves across the frozen surface, slipping, falling, and instantly scrambling back up without a pause. Behind me, the starboard watertight door to the bridge wing burst open. The first mate stumbled out, his orange survival suit half-zipped. He was carrying a flare gun in one hand and a duffel bag in the other. "Thorne!" he yelled. "Get to the lifeboats! We're abandoning!" "Abandoning?" I gestured to the ice. "To go where, Mike? Look at them!" He did not look. His eyes were wide, the pupils blown out with adrenaline. "Radio says the docks are overrun. The chief took the fast rescue boat. He's gone. Captain's dead in the wheelhouse. We have to go." "The captain is what?" "Bit through," Mike screamed. His throat is gone. I locked the door. I'm leaving." He ran toward the davit where the port lifeboat hung suspended. He was panicking. He was not thinking about the mechanics of the launch. The lifeboat falls were caked in ice. The winch brake would be frozen solid. "Mike, wait!" I shouted, stepping away from the rail. "The boat will not lower. The grease is frozen." He ignored me. He scrambled into the fiberglass shell of the boat, and I heard him frantically hammering on the release lever. A metallic clack, clack, clack echoed across the deck. The brake did not release. He was trapping himself in a plastic box while the world ended. I turned back to the ice. The first of the figures had reached the hull. It was a man in a torn Carhartt jacket. He did not slow down as he approached the steel wall of the ship. He slammed into the hull plating at a full run. The sound was a dull, wet thud. He bounced off, hit the ice, and immediately sprang back up, clawing at the smooth, painted steel. His fingers left streaks of blood on the black paint. He looked up. His face was a ruin. The skin was pale, almost translucent in the flat light, pulled tight over the skull. His mouth hung open, slack and dark. He was not looking at me. He was looking at the movement. Then I saw the accommodation ladder. The gangway was down. We had lowered it in preparation for docking, and in the chaos of the grounding, nobody had raised it. The aluminum stairs stretched down from the main deck, the bottom platform resting precariously on the shifting ice. It was a highway. 3 of the figures were already on the lower platform. They scrambled over the railings, ignoring the steps, pulling themselves up the structure with a strength that looked mechanical. I did not think about the crew. I did not think about the captain bleeding out in the wheelhouse. I thought about the geometry of the ship. The Iron Range was a fortress. Smooth vertical sides, 30 feet of freeboard. The only way on was that ladder. If I cut the ladder, the ship became an island. If I did not, it became a tomb. I turned and sprinted toward the deck locker near the smokestack. My boots hammered against the steel grating. I slipped once on a patch of oil and ice, my hip slamming into a vent pipe, but the pain barely registered. I ripped the locker open. Inside sat the oxyacetylene torch card. It was a heavy, awkward beast, 2 tall steel cylinders chained to a dolly. Oxygen and acetylene. I grabbed the handle and hauled it backward. The wheels were seized with rust and cold. I put my shoulder into it and shoved. The cart skidded across the non-skid paint, the cylinders clanking together with a hollow, bell-like ring. I dragged it to the top of the gangway. The figures were halfway up now. I could hear them. Not screaming, not growling. Just the heavy, wet sound of their breathing and the frantic slapping of their hands on the aluminum rails. I unspooled the twin hoses, the rubber stiff and resisting my grip. I cracked the valve on the black acetylene tank. Quarter turn. I cracked the green oxygen valve. Full turn. I grabbed the striker, a simple flint cup on a spring steel handle. I purged the lines, listening for the hiss of gas. The smell of garlic, the additive in the acetylene, hit my nose. I squeezed the striker. The sparks snapped. Whoosh. A jagged, smoky orange flame erupted from the torch tip, dancing in the wind. I dialed up the oxygen. The flame tightened, turned blue, and roared. A precise, focused cone of heat hot enough to turn steel into soup. The first infected was 10 feet away. It was a woman in a park ranger uniform. Her jaw was hanging by a tendon. She saw me, or she saw the fire, and she lunged, grabbing the handrail to vault the last few steps. I did not aim the torch at her. Flesh burns, but it does not stop mass. I kicked the torch cart over on its side to anchor it and dropped to my knees at the pivot point of the gangway. The entire structure was held to the ship by 2 massive steel pins, each about an inch thick. I brought the blue tip of the flame to the head of the port side pin. The steel did not want to melt. It was cold, acting as a massive heat sink. I held the torch steady, my hands shaking with adrenaline. The metal began to sweat, then glowed cherry red. The infected woman slammed into the safety gate at the top of the stairs. The chain rattled violently but held. She reached through the gap, her fingers snapping inches from my face. I ignored her. I focused on the puddle of molten metal forming under the flame. "Come on," I whispered. "Flow." I hit the cutting lever. A jet of pure oxygen blasted into the molten steel. A shower of sparks, bright and angry like miniature meteors, sprayed across the deck. The steel pin surrendered, spraying out the back in a stream of liquid fire. The port side of the gangway groaned. I scrambled to the starboard pin. The woman was climbing over the gate now. She was entangled in the safety netting, thrashing with that terrible, silent efficiency. Another figure was right behind her, pushing her forward. I applied the heat to the second pin. The wind whipped the sparks back onto my coat. I smelled burning canvas. I did not flinch. The heat was the only thing that mattered. Red, orange, yellow, white. I hit the oxygen lever. The metal severed with a violent hiss. For a second, nothing happened. The rust held the gangway in place. I stood up, grabbed the heavy pry bar from the torch cart, and jammed it into the gap between the gangway and the hull. I leaned my entire weight into it. Go! I gritted my teeth, the muscles in my back screaming. With a sound like a gunshot, the rust broke. The gangway detached. Gravity took over. The heavy aluminum structure swung away from the ship, carrying the three climbing figures with it. They did not scream as they fell. They just flailed silently in the air. The gangway crashed onto the ice below. The impact shattered the frozen surface, sending the metal structure and the bodies plunging into the black water. The ice floes bobbed and then closed back up, sealing them under. I stood at the edge of the void, chest heaving. The cold air burned my lungs. Below, on the ice, dozens more faces looked up at me. They paced back and forth along the hull, scratching at the steel plates, unable to climb the sheer, ice-coated walls. I was alone. I killed the torch. The roar of the flame died, leaving only the sound of the wind whistling through the rigging and the distant, rhythmic grinding of the ice against the hull. I checked the valves on the tanks. Closed. Safety caps screwed back on. Procedure. Always follow procedure. I looked toward the lifeboat station. The davit was empty. The falls hung loose, swaying in the wind. Mike had managed to launch, or the winch had failed and dropped him. I walked to the rail and looked down. The fiberglass lifeboat was upside down on the ice, split open like a cracked egg. A smear of red marked the jagged edge of the hull. Figures were swarming over it, pulling at something inside. I turned away. There was no time for mourning. The ship was sealed, but it was not secure. I had power, I had heat, and I had food. But I also had a dead captain in the wheelhouse and 1,000 feet of steel corridors that I had not cleared. I checked the load in my pockets. A flashlight, a multi-tool, a roll of electrical tape, my wrench. I walked back toward the heavy steel door of the accommodation block. I spun the wheel, undogging the latches, and stepped inside. I leaned my weight against the door, swinging it shut. I spun the wheel again, feeling the locking bars slide home into the frame. The heavy thud of the latches engaging felt final. I was inside the lung of the beast now. My first priority was the engine control room. I needed to stabilize the plant. If the generator died, the heat died. If the heat died, the pipes burst. If the pipes burst, the ship flooded. I moved down the corridor, my boots squeaking on the linoleum. The silence of the ship was heavy. Usually you hear the vibration of the crew, boots on decks, doors opening, voices. Now, there was only the hum of the ventilation and the distant idle of the main engine. I reached the stairwell. I paused, listening. Above me, on the bridge deck, I heard a sound, a rhythmic, wet slapping sound, like bare feet on tile. I gripped my wrench tighter. The captain was up there. Or what used to be the captain. I did not go up. I went down. The engine room was my territory. It was a maze of high-pressure pipes, catwalks, and shadowed corners. It was defensible. I could lock the watertight doors. I could pressurize the fire main. I could turn the lights off and navigate by touch. I descended the stairs, moving fast. I hit the landing for the upper engine deck and swung through the door. The heat embraced me. The smell of oil was better than the smell of the cold wind. I walked to the main switchboard in the control room. The gauges were steady. Generator number 1 was carrying the load. The frequency was solid at 60 Hz. I picked up the black marker attached to the whiteboard by the desk. Under the heading Current Status, I wiped away the old notes about oil changes and filter swaps. I wrote 3 words in block letters: secure, isolate, survive. Then I uncapped my thermos, which was still sitting on the console from my morning watch. The coffee was lukewarm and tasted like sludge. I drank it anyway. I looked at the CCTV monitors. Screen 4 showed the bridge. The camera was grainy, but I could see the wheelhouse. The captain was standing by the radar pedestal. He was swaying back and forth, bumping gently into the console. Every time he hit it, he snapped his teeth at the plastic buttons. I reached out and turned off the monitor. "Captain," I said to the blank screen. "You have the bridge. I have the engine." I sat down in the swivel chair and pulled the ship's schematics from the drawer. I needed to inventory every point of entry, every vent, every skylight, every hawse pipe. The Iron Range was not a ship anymore. It was a steel island in a frozen sea. And I was the governor, the mechanic, and the army. I looked at the fuel gauge for the daily service tank. 12 hours of fuel before I had to transfer from the bunkers. "Problem 1, I muttered. I stood up and grabbed my wrench. Work to do. Survival is a thermodynamic equation. You are a biological engine that burns calories to maintain an internal temperature of 98.6 degrees. The ship is a steel engine that burns hydrocarbons to maintain a jacket water temperature of 170 degrees. If either of us drops below our operating range, the chemistry stops, and the freezing dark of Lake Superior wins. The Iron Range was bleeding heat. I stood in the engine control room, ECR, staring at the mimic panel. The ECR was a glass-walled box suspended above the main machinery space, sound-insulated and air-conditioned. It was the brain of the ship. Right now, the brain was telling me the body was dying. The main engine was at idle, declutched. It was not generating enough waste heat to keep the exhaust gas economizer working. The steam pressure gauge was dropping. 100 psi, 95, 90. Steam is life. On a heavy fuel ship, you do not just use steam for heating the showers. You use it to trace the fuel lines. The bunker tanks are filled with intermediate fuel oil, IFO 380. It's thick, black, tar-like stuff. At room temperature, it has the consistency of cold molasses. At the temperature of the hull plating right now, near freezing, it would turn into asphalt. If the fuel lines froze, the pumps would cavitate, the generator would starve, and the lights would go out. If the lights went out, I would freeze to death in the dark with 1,000 tons of solidifying tar in the belly of the ship. I grabbed my leather gloves and a pipe wrench. I needed to fire the auxiliary boiler. I left the sanctuary of the ECR and stepped out onto the grating. The noise hit me first, the rhythmic, syncopated clatter of the number 1 generator. It was a Detroit diesel, screaming away at 1,800 RPM to keep the voltage steady. I slid down the handrails to the boiler deck. The auxiliary boiler was a massive vertical cylinder, painted silver, wrapped in insulation. It sat silent, cold. I checked the water level in the sight glass. Half full. Good. I walked to the burner control box. It was an old electromechanical unit, a nest of relays and timers. I flipped the switch to manual. I engaged the forced draft fan. The electric motor spun up, a rising whine that vibrated through the floor plates. I waited for the purge cycle to clear any explosive gases from the furnace. 30 seconds of waiting, watching the pressure gauge on the fuel rail. I pressed the ignition button. The electrodes sparked. I could not see them, but I heard the contactor slam shut inside the panel. A solenoid clicked, opening the pilot gas valve. Then, the main fuel valve opened. Ignition was a physical sensation. A deep, concussive whoomp resonated through the boiler casing, shaking the dust off the overhead pipes. The roar of combustion settled into a steady, hollow drone. I watched the flame through the small quartz inspection port, a swirling vortex of yellow and orange fire. Heat began to radiate from the casing. The needle on the steam pressure gauge quivered and started to climb. Step 1 complete. The blood of the ship would stay liquid. I did not have time to celebrate. A yellow warning light strobed on the alarm panel overhead. Low suction pressure, suction pump 1. Seawater pump number 1. This was the pump that sucked water from the lake to cool the freshwater loop that cooled the engine. If the seawater stopped, the fresh water boiled. If the fresh water boiled, the generator seized. I sprinted down the lower stairs to the tank top, the lowest level of the ship. This was the bilge. The air here was heavy with humidity and the smell of ancient oil. The sea chest was a massive steel box welded to the hull, the intake point for the lake water. The big centrifugal pump next to it was making a sound that made my teeth ache, a chaotic, gravelly grinding noise. Cavitation. It was starving for water. I looked at the suction gauge. It was pulling a vacuum. Frazzle ice. I spat the words out. Supercooled water creates invisible crystals, sticky, slushy ice that adheres to everything it touches. The intake strainers on the outside of the hull were clogging up with the stuff. The lake was trying to choke us. I grabbed the valve wheel on the suction side and muscled it closed. The pump note changed. Higher. Sharper. I killed the power at the local breaker box. The silence from that corner of the room was terrifying. I had maybe 10 minutes before the generator temperature spiked. I looked at the strainer housing, a heavy cast-iron cylinder with a lid bolted down by 6 massive nuts. I needed to clear the basket, but opening it would not solve the problem on the outside of the hull. I needed to blow the intake clear. I looked up at the overhead piping. There was a steam service line running to a heater unit near the bilge well. Thermodynamics, I whispered. Heat beats ice. I grabbed a coil of heavy-duty steam hose from the bulkhead rack. It was thick, reinforced rubber with bronze couplings. I dragged it across the deck plates, the brass fittings ringing against the steel. I used my wrench to crack the union on the steam heater line. A jet of hot vapor shrieked out, scalding the air. I ignored the heat, jamming the hose coupling onto the threads and tightening it down until the veins stood out in my forearms. Next, I turned to the sea chest. There was a vent valve on the top of the suction pipe, used to bleed air. I stripped the cap off. I connected the other end of the steam hose to the vent. I was about to inject 300-degree steam directly into the frozen throat of the intake. I stood back and grabbed the isolation valve on the steam line. I took a breath. This could blow a gasket. It could rupture the hose. I cranked the valve open. The hose stiffened violently, jumping on the deck like a living snake. The sound was incredible. A high-pressure scream of steam fighting against water and ice. The steel pipe of the sea chest groaned, thermally expanding. I kept my hand on the valve, ready to shut it if the rubber burst. I watched the pressure gauge on the suction line. It was pinned at maximum pressure. For 30 seconds, the boiler poured its energy into the lake. Then, a deep, shuddering vibration ran through the hull plates under my feet. It felt like the ship had coughed. I closed the steam valve. The screaming died away. I reached for the main suction valve of the seawater pump. I cranked it open. I watched the gauge. 0 vacuum. The water was flowing freely to the pump casing. I hit the start button on the pump motor. The motor kicked in with a smooth, magnetic hum. The gravelly grinding noise was gone, replaced by the steady, rushing swoosh of water moving through pipes. I checked the generator temperature. 180. Steady. I slumped against the cold steel of the hull, wiping sweat from my forehead with a greasy sleeve. The ship was alive, but it was a fragile life. I could not run the whole ship. It was too big, and I had too many enemies. The accommodation block, the 5-story hotel stacked on the stern, was a liability. It was full of cabins, galleys, mess halls, and offices. It was also full of dead airspace that required heating. And, somewhere on the bridge deck, it contained the captain. I needed to shrink my world. I went to the HVAC room on the boat deck. This was the mechanical heart of the living quarters. Massive fans and ductwork fed warm air to every room. I stood before the main supply fan. It was the size of a small car. I pulled the disconnect lever. The contactor opened with a sharp snap, and the fan began to spin down, the wind noise dying into a low moan. Next, the steam heating coils. I found the isolation valves for the accommodation block loop. These were big gate valves, 6 inches in diameter, untouched for years. The paint on the stems was thick. I hooked my wrench onto the wheel of the supply valve. I braced my boot against the pipe support and pulled. The friction of the rust fought me. I grunted, the effort turning my vision spotty. The valve broke free with a grinding screech of metal on metal. I spun it shut. Then the return valve. Same fight. Same victory. I had just cut off the life support to the upper decks. Within hours, the temperature in the cabins, the galley, and the wheelhouse would drop to match the outside air. By midnight, the bridge would be 0 degrees. By morning, 10 below. If the captain was still moving up there, he would freeze solid. The infected might be fast, they might be strong, but they were still made of water and meat. You cannot run a marathon when your muscle fibers are frozen into crystalline jerky. I was weaponizing the winter. Bunkerization. I retreated to the engine room. This was my citadel. I went to the main watertight door on the upper deck, the primary entrance from the accommodation block to the machinery space. It was a heavy steel slab with 6 locking dogs. I spun the wheel, driving the dogs deep into the frame. But that was not enough. I went to the workshop and grabbed the portable stick welder. I dragged the heavy leads up the stairs. I clamped the ground cable to the door frame. I loaded a 6011 rod into the stinger, a rod designed for dirty, rusty steel. I lowered my welding hood. I struck the arc. The electric fire sizzled, bright as a supernova in the dim corridor. The smell of ozone and burning flux filled the air. I ran a heavy bead of weld across the top of the door dogs. I welded the wheel to the shaft. I welded the hinges to the frame. I was not just locking the door, I was fusing it. Nothing was getting through that door without a plasma cutter or high explosives. I repeated the process for the emergency escape hatch and the funnel casing. When I was done, the only way into the engine room was through the hull itself or via the heavy bolted hatches on the main deck which were accessible only from the outside. I was sealed in. I returned to the ECR. The adrenaline was fading, replaced by a deep, aching fatigue. My hands were shaking, not from fear, but from low blood sugar and exhaustion. I checked the fuel status again. The daily service tank was holding steady, but I needed to process more fuel before I could sleep. I walked to the purifier room. This was a small, loud chamber housing the centrifuges. These machines spun at 10,000 RPM, generating thousands of Gs of force to separate water and heavy particles from the fuel oil. I checked the heater temperature. The oil needed to be exactly 98 degrees Celsius to separate properly. I adjusted the steam controller. I engaged the clutch on number 1 purifier. The bowl began to spin.
It took a long time to come up to speed, the pitch rising slowly, agonizingly, until it reached a high harmonic whine that you felt in your fillings. I opened the feed valve. I watched the sight glass on the clean oil outlet. A stream of dark amber fluid began to flow. Clean, hot, combustible energy. Every drop of that oil bought me another second of light, another second of heat. The nest. I could not sleep in my cabin. My cabin was on the officer's deck, in the freezing zone, on the other side of my welded door. I scavenged. I found a pile of clean rags in the storeroom. I found a roll of rubber floor matting. I found a heavy winter coverall that had belonged to the wiper. I built a nest in the corner of the ECR, between the switchboard and the coffee maker. I laid down the rubber mats for insulation, piled the rags into a mattress shape, and used the coveralls as a sleeping bag. I set up my perimeter. I did not have motion sensors. I had gravity. I took a stack of heavy steel washers and a spool of fishing line from my tackle box. I used to fish off the fantail during long anchorages. I strung the line across the grating at the top of the stairs leading down to the lower engine room, the only approach vector from the hull. I tied the line to a wrench balanced precariously on the handrail. If anything walked up those stairs, they would trip the line, and the wrench would fall 6 feet onto the steel deck plates. In this acoustic chamber, that impact would sound like a gunshot.
I sat on my makeshift bed. I opened a can of peaches with my multi-tool, eating them straight from the tin. The syrup tasted metallic and sweet. I looked at the mimic panel. Green lights. Generator 1, running. Aux boiler, running. Fuel pressure, normal. Seawater temp, 34 Fahrenheit. The machine was happy. The ship was a self-sustaining loop of energy. I pulled the logbook onto my lap. I clicked my pen. Day 1, 2200 hours. Location, grounded, Marquette Harbor. Status, ship secure. Gangway cut. Superstructure isolated and freezing. Fuel, 140 tons. IFO, 30 tons. DO. Souls on board. 1 confirmed living. I hesitated. I thought about Mike in the lifeboat. I thought about the chief speeding away. I thought about the captain snapping his teeth at the radar. I closed the book. I turned off the overhead fluorescent lights, leaving only the soft red glow of the emergency lighting and the green LEDs of the gauges. The hum of the generator was a lullaby. It was the sound of competence. It was the sound of life. I laid my head on the pile of rags, gripping the handle of my 3-pound hammer. Outside, the wind was howling against the steel plating, trying to find a crack. Inside, the pistons hammered in their sleeves, pushing back against the dark. I closed my eyes, visualizing the flow of steam, the spin of the turbine, the atomization of the fuel. The systems held. The ship woke me before the alarm did. I had been asleep for 3 hours, curled in my nest of oily rags on the engine control room floor. Deep sleep, the kind born of total exhaustion, where the brain shuts down the sensory processing centers to save glucose. But the sailor's ear never truly sleeps. It listens for the frequency of the machinery. The frequency changed. The steady, rhythmic thrum of the Detroit diesel generator, a sound that had been the heartbeat of my existence, stuttered. It missed a beat. Then another. The pitch dropped, sliding down the acoustic scale from a confident hum to a choking rattle. Then, gravity shifted. It was not a roll. A ship rolls with a fluid, oscillating grace. This was a lurch. The deck under me dropped away to the starboard side, sharp and violent, like a table leg had been kicked out. My toolbox slid across the linoleum, slamming into the base of the main console. The coffee mug I'd left on the desk launched itself into the air, shattering against the bulkhead. Then the lights died. The darkness was absolute. It was a physical weight pressing against my eyes. The hum of the ventilation fans spooled down into silence. The pumps stopped. The boiler flame would be extinguished instantly as the solenoid valves snapped shut. Silence reclaimed the iron range. I lay there in the dark, my heart hammering against my ribs. The ship groaned.
It was a terrifying, deep earth sound. Steel plates twisting, rivets popping, structural frames protesting against a load they were never designed to bear. We were moving. The ice was moving. I fumbled for the flashlight clipped to my chest pocket. My thumb found the rubberized button. The beam cut a stark, white cone through the dust-filled air of the control room. I scrambled to the console. The gauges were dead, black needles on black faces. "Think," I hissed. "Do not panic. Solve." Why did the generator trip? It was a diesel engine. It did not need electricity to run. It needed fuel, air, and compression. I looked at the inclinometer mounted on the pillar. The bubble was pegged hard to starboard, 15 degrees. We were listing heavily. The oil level switch, I realized. The safety systems on the generator were designed to prevent the engine from running dry if the oil sump ran low. With a 15-degree list, the oil in the pan had sloshed to the side, away from the sensor float. The brain of the generator thought it was empty and killed the fuel to save the bearings. It was a suicide pact. The machine was saving itself, but it was killing me. I needed that engine running. Without it, the heat was gone. In this temperature, I had maybe 20 minutes before the residual heat in the pipes dissipated and the water began to expand into ice. Once that happened, the block would crack and the ship was dead forever. I grabbed my tool bag and sprinted out of the ECR. The beam of my light danced wildly on the gratings. The list made running a nightmare. I was effectively running on the wall, one hand gripping the railing to keep from sliding into the abyss of the lower engine room. I reached the generator flat. The silence here was wrong. The smell of unburned diesel fuel hung sharp in the air. I knelt beside the engine block. The heat radiating from it was already fading. I located the low oil shutdown sensor, a small brass housing screwed into the side of the oil pan. 2 wires protruded from it. I did not have time to level the ship. I had to lie to the machine. I pulled my wire strippers from my belt. I snipped the 2 wires leading to the sensor. I stripped the insulation from the ends, exposing the bright copper strands. "Sorry, old girl," I muttered. "I'm overriding your survival instinct." I twisted the copper ends together, bypassing the switch. I wrapped the connection tight with electrical tape. Now for the restart. The electric starter motor was useless without the main bus energized. I had to use the hydraulic start accumulator. It's a manual backup, a pressurized cylinder of oil that spins a hydraulic motor to crank the engine. I grabbed the pump handle on the side of the accumulator. It looked like a car jack handle. I started to pump. Resistance was heavy. I needed to build 3,000 psi of pressure. 1 stroke. 2 strokes.
The sweat broke out on my forehead instantly. The ship groaned again, a metallic shriek echoing from the bow, vibrating through the hull plating. The list increased. I had to brace my boot against the generator skid to keep from falling. 10 strokes. 20. My breath rasped in the cold air. The pressure gauge on the accumulator climbed slowly. Red zone. Yellow zone. 30 strokes. My triceps burned. I gritted my teeth, forcing the handle down. Green zone. I dropped the handle and grabbed the manual fuel lever, pulling it to the start position. With my other hand, I gripped the release valve on the hydraulic line. "Wake up," I commanded. I yanked the lever. The hydraulic fluid dumped into the starter motor with a violent hiss. The engine spun. Whir. It caught on the second revolution. Chugga-boom! A plume of black smoke erupted from the exhaust, lagging. The engine roared to life, hunting for a second before the governor caught it and smoothed the idle into a steady, deafening rhythm. The overhead lights flickered, buzzed, and slammed back on. I slumped against the vibrating steel of the casing, gasping for air. The lights were back. The pumps would restart automatically. The heat would return. But the list remained. I walked to the railing and looked down into the lower level. The bilge water was sloshing high on the starboard side, dark and oily. But it was not rising fast. The hull integrity in the engine room was intact. So why were we listing? I went back to the ECR and checked the remote tank soundings. The panel was lit up like a Christmas tree. 4-peak tank. Flooded. Ballast tank 1 port. Empty. Ballast tank 1 starboard. Flooded. The bow. The grounding had torn the bottom out of the forward section. The storm surge must have lifted the stern and slammed the bow down hard on the rocks, rupturing the starboard tanks. We were twisting. Then I heard it. It was not the ship. It was a sound that did not belong in the mechanical symphony of the vessel. It was coming from the forward bulkhead, the collision bulkhead that separated the engine room from the cargo tunnel. Clang, scrape, clang. It sounded like someone was hitting the steel door with a sledgehammer. But the rhythm was wrong. It was too fast, too frantic. I grabbed my heavy spanner and walked to the watertight door at the forward end of the engine room. This door led into the tunnel, the 800-foot-long underbelly of the ship. A narrow, dark corridor that ran beneath the cargo holds, housing the massive conveyor belt that unloaded the taconite. I pressed my ear against the cold steel of the door. Through the inches of steel, I heard the echoes. Not just banging, running, footsteps. Dozens of them, on the metal grating of the tunnel catwalk. My stomach turned to ice. The tunnel ran all the way to the bow, the loop belt transfer station. If the hull was breached in the forepeak, and the collision bulkhead at the bow had failed, they were inside. They were in the tunnel. And this door, this single, dogged-shut door, was the only thing separating my secure engine room from a horde of infected rushing through the dark artery of the ship. I checked the dogs. They were tight. But for how long? I needed to know if the breach was total. If they filled the tunnel, they would eventually find a vent, a cable run, or they would just pile up against this door until the sheer pressure popped the latches. I could not fight them here. If I opened this door, I lost the Citadel. I had to seal the tunnel at the other end, or at least somewhere in the middle.
I had to stop the flow. But I could not go through this door. That would be suicide. Think, I whispered, pacing the grating. Access. The deck access. There were escape trunks, vertical ladders enclosed in steel tubes spaced every 100 feet along the main deck. They dropped directly into the tunnel. If I went out onto the weather deck, fought my way forward through the wind and ice, and dropped down an escape trunk ahead of them, I could engage the section isolation doors. It was a terrible plan. It required leaving the fortress. It required entering the confined space of the tunnel. But if I did nothing, they would siege the engine room door. They would find the cable penetrations. They would get in.
I went to the workshop. I needed weapons. I needed tools. I took the oxyacetylene torch. No, too heavy to carry. I took the stick welder. Useless without power in the tunnel. I grabbed a wrecking bar, 3 feet of hexagonal steel with a chisel tip. I grabbed a heavy ball-peen hammer. I grabbed a box of road flares. And then I looked at the shelf of chemicals. Ether, starting fluid cans, high volatility, methanol, windshield wash. I grabbed 4 cans of ether and taped them together into a bundle. I taped a road flare to the side of the bundle, an improvised incendiary device. Crude, but physics does not care about elegance. I put on my heavy coat, my hard hat, and my gloves. I checked the seal on my safety glasses. I left the engine room, welding the door shut behind me again. No time. I locked it and jammed a steel wedge into the handwheel spokes. I climbed the internal stairs to the main deck access. I pushed open the weather door. The violence of the storm hit me instantly. The wind was a solid wall, screaming at 50 knots. The snow was horizontal, stinging like birdshot. The deck was a sheet of glass, angled at 15 degrees. I clipped my safety harness to the lifeline running along the hatch combings. I began to crawl. The ship was a ghost. The massive hatch cranes loomed in the darkness like skeletal dinosaurs. The lights of the distant shore were gone. There was only the black void of the lake and the white spray of the waves crashing over the grounded bow. I moved forward. 100 feet. 200 feet. The wind tried to peel me off the deck. My boots scrabbled for traction on the non-skid paint, which was buried under an inch of rime ice. I reached the number 3 escape trunk. This was amidships, roughly halfway between the bow and the stern. If the infected were coming from the bow, they would be moving aft. If I dropped in here, I might be dropping right on top of them. Or I might be behind them. Or ahead of them. Schrodinger's tunnel. I undogged the hatch. The wind caught it and ripped it from my hand, slamming it back against the stopper with a bone-jarring clang. I looked down into the hole. It was a black throat. I lit a road flare. The red phosphorus hissed, sputtering in the wind, then caught with a blinding crimson glare. I dropped the flare down the shaft. It fell 30 feet, bouncing off the ladder rungs, casting wild, spinning shadows. It landed on the grating below. I watched. Nothing moved in the red light. The tunnel section below looked empty. The massive black rubber of the conveyor belt sat silent in the center. I took a breath, clipped the lanyard of my wrecking bar to my wrist, and stepped onto the ladder. Descending into the belly of the ship was like descending into a different world. The wind noise faded, replaced by the deep, resonant groaning of the hull. The air grew still and smelled of iron dust and damp rubber. I hit the grating. I retrieved the flare, holding it high. The tunnel stretched out in both directions, fading into infinite darkness. To my left, aft, the path led to the engine room,
To my right, forward, it led to the breach. I heard them. They were coming from the forward section. The sound was amplified by the steel tube, a chaotic clattering of footsteps, like rain on a tin roof, but heavier. I looked at the Section 3 watertight door. It was 10 feet away, a heavy, sliding steel barrier designed to isolate the tunnel in case of flooding. It was open. I ran to it. The mechanism was a manual rack and pinion gear, operated by a large handwheel. I grabbed the wheel and pulled. It did not move. Rust, I swore. Always rust. The ship had not been in a collision situation in 40 years. The grease on the gear track had hardened into a substance resembling epoxy. I heard a shriek from the darkness ahead. They had seen the light of the flare. The sound of the footsteps changed. They accelerated. The chaotic clatter synchronized into a rhythmic drumming. They were charging. I jammed the tip of my wrecking bar into the spokes of the handwheel to create a lever. I threw my weight against it. Grind. The gear moved an inch. I reset the bar. I shoved again. Grind. Another inch.
The door was heavy steel, moving on rollers. It needed momentum. I looked down the tunnel. At the edge of the flare's light, I saw movement. Pale shapes emerging from the shadows. They were running on the catwalks on both sides of the conveyor belt. Some were running on the belt itself. They were maybe 200 yards away, closing fast. "Move!" I screamed at the door. I hammered the wheel with the flat of the wrecking bar, vibrating the mechanism to break the stiction. I grabbed the rim and heaved. The door lurched. It began to slide, slowly at first, then gaining speed as it rolled down the slight incline caused by the ship's list. I needed to close it, but I also needed to make sure they did not just open it again. These doors did not lock from one side. They were just barriers. I spun the wheel, driving the door across the tunnel width. The gap narrowed. 6 feet. 4 feet. The lead infected was sprinting now, a man in a blue coverall, missing an arm. He did not look in pain. He looked focused. He was 50 yards out. The door slammed into the jam with a thunderous crash. I grabbed the locking lever, a heavy steel arm that cammed the door tight against the rubber gasket. I yanked it down. Click. Sealed. But it was not enough. They were strong. I had seen them dent steel. If 50 of them pushed against this door, the latch might fail. I needed a weld. I did not have a welder. I needed a wedge. I looked at the floor. The grating was composed of removable sections. I dropped to my knees and jammed the pry bar under the edge of a floor grate section right in front of the door track. I heaved up. The clips popped. The section of heavy steel grating lifted. I flipped it up and jammed it vertically between the door handle and the structural frame of the conveyor support. It was a crude shore, a brace that physically prevented the handle from being lifted. Thud. The first body hit the other side of the door. The steel plate vibrated against my hand. Thud, thud, thud. More impacts. They were piling up against it. The door groaned. The rubber gasket squealed as the pressure mounted. I stepped back, raising my flare. The red light illuminated the scene, the dark industrial tunnel, the massive belt, the sealed door vibrating like a drum skin. Then I saw the gap, the conveyor belt. The watertight door was designed to close around the belt, but it did not seal perfectly. There was a flexible rubber skirt at the bottom, but the belt itself passed through a cutout. Under the belt, there was a gap, maybe 8 inches high. A hand shot through the gap. Pale, scraped fingers clawed at the air, grasping blindly. Then another hand.
Then a face pressed into the rubber skirt, trying to push through. The skirt bulged. The material was thick, but it was old. It started to tear. No. I stepped forward. I could not seal that gap with steel.
I did not have the material. I looked at the bundle of ether cans in my pocket. I looked at the conveyor belt control box on the wall next to me. The belt was dead. The generator was running the ship's hotel load, but the heavy 480-volt breakers for the deck machinery were usually off. But I had restarted the generator manually. I had not checked the main switchboard configuration. If the breakers were still closed from the last unloading, I ran to the control box. A big green button, start. A big red button, stop. And a pull cord emergency stop running the length of the tunnel. I did not want to start it. I wanted to use the mechanical potential. The belt was loaded. There were tons of taconite pellets sitting on it further aft. If I released the brake, I looked at the drive motor housing. The brake was a hydraulic caliper acting on a disc. There was a manual release lever for maintenance. The infected were pushing harder. The rubber skirt ripped. A head pushed through, snarling, eyes milky white, teeth snapping. It was crawling out from under the door like a cockroach. I ran to the motor. I grabbed the brake release lever. "Gravity," I whispered. "Do your job." I yanked the lever. The brake calipers opened. For a second, nothing happened. Then, the weight of the oar on the incline of the stern section overcame the static friction. The belt began to move, but not forward, backward. The ship was listing, and the stern was low. The loaded belt started to roll downhill toward the engine room, dragging the belt from the forward section with it. The bottom run of the belt, the return side, was what passed through the door gap. As the top side moved aft, the bottom side moved forward, into the breach. The belt accelerated. Whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. The rollers spun. The rubber belt, thick as a tank tread, shot forward through the gap under the door. The head sticking through the gap did not stand a chance. The moving belt grabbed the infected shoulder and ground it against the steel floor plate. Friction took over. The belt acted like a massive sanding belt. There was a sickening crunch. The body was dragged back under the door, jammed into the narrow clearance, and pulverized. The belt kept moving, picking up speed. It became a moving wall of rubber, screaming through the gap at 10 miles per hour. Nothing could crawl against that friction. Any hand that reached under was instantly flayed. I watched for 10 seconds. The pile of bodies on the other side must have been growing, but the gap was now a meat grinder. I released the brake lever. The calipers slammed shut. The belt screeched to a halt. The gap was plugged, jammed solid with the remains of the first intruder, compressed by the belt tension. It was a gruesome seal, but it was airtight. The banging on the door continued, but the urgency was gone. They could not get under. The door held. I stood there in the red dying light of the flare, shaking. My hands were black with grease and blood. I had sealed the artery. But I was still in the tunnel, and I was 400 feet from the engine room. I turned aft. The flare sputtered and died. Darkness rushed back in, heavier than before. I clicked my flashlight on. The beam was dimming, batteries dying in the cold. Move, I told myself. Get back to the anchor. I began the long walk back to the engine room access, stepping over the piles of taconite, listening to the wind howling far above and the scratching of the things on the other side of the steel door. I had bought time, but the ship was still listing,
and the winter was just getting started. Time is no longer measured in hours or dates. It is measured in gallons. My universe has contracted to a specific mathematical formula: burn rate versus bunker capacity. The main generator, a Detroit diesel 12V71, consumes approximately 12 gallons of fuel per hour under the current hotel load. I have 140 tons of intermediate fuel oil in the settling tanks and another 40 tons of marine diesel in the storage tanks. I do the math every morning while the coffee brews. At current consumption, assuming no catastrophic leaks and no need for high-load heating, the Iron Range will remain warm and illuminated for 416 days. That is my calendar.
I am currently on day 42 of the Holocene of Kalen Thorne. The routine is the only thing that separates me from the entropy outside. I wake up at 0600. I do not set an alarm. The vibration of the deck plates is my circadian rhythm. If the vibration changes frequency by even a fraction of a hertz, I am awake instantly, adrenaline dumping into my system before my eyes are open. I live in the engine control room. It has become a hybrid space, half industrial command center, half studio apartment. My sleeping nest is in the corner, raised on pallets to keep it off the cold floor. My kitchen is a hot plate wired directly into a 120-volt outlet on the lighting panel. My library is the shelf of technical manuals for the purifier systems and the pumps. The ship lists permanently at 15 degrees to starboard. This defines every physical action I take. Walking is a constant uphill or downhill struggle. Coffee in a cup sits at a surreal angle relative to the rim. Sleeping requires wedging myself against the wall so I do not roll across the room. I poured the coffee. It was black, thick, and tasted faintly of the copper pipes I used to distill the water. "Morning check," I said to the empty room. My voice sounded flat, absorbed instantly by the acoustic tiling. I spoke aloud to keep the vocal cords elastic, to remember the sensation of language. I picked up the clipboard. I walked the panel. Jacket water temperature, 175 degrees Fahrenheit. Lube oil pressure, 60 psi. Bus voltage, 450 volts. Frequency, 60 hertz. The machine was happy. The machine did not know the world had ended. It only knew that as long as I fed it refined hydrocarbons, it would push back the cold. The perimeter sweep. I put on my heavy canvas coat and grabbed the wrecking bar. This was the morning commute. I left the ECR and stepped out onto the upper engine deck. The air here was warm, smelling of oil and ozone. I descended the stairs to the lower level, my boots compensating automatically for the list. The watertight door to the tunnel, the one I had sealed 40 days ago, was the first stop. I did not open it. I never opened it. I pressed my ear against the cold steel. In the first week, there had been scratching. There had been the occasional heavy thud of a body throwing itself against the metal. Now, there was silence. The tunnel was unheated. The temperature in there would be ambient, probably 20 below zero. Whatever had been trapped on the other side was now part of the ship's thermal mass, frozen statues in the dark, waiting for a thaw that I would never allow to happen. I checked the wedge I had jammed into the handwheel. It was tight. I checked the weld beads on the hinges. Solid. Clear, I muttered. I moved to the hull checks. I walked the length of the bilge, shining my flashlight into the dark recesses under the floor plates. The starboard list meant the bilge water pooled deep against the hull on that side. It was dark, oily water, freezing in the corners where the insulation was thin. I checked the patch on the seat chest. The steam hose was still connected, leaking a small plume of vapor that kept the intake from icing over. It was a parasitic loss of heat,
but the cost of doing business. I climbed back up. The physical exertion felt good. It reminded me that I was a biological entity, not just a cog in the diesel cycle. The high ground. Every 3 days, weather permitting, I went to the summit. The funnel casing had an internal ladder that reached all the way to the top of the smokestack. It was a long, vertical climb through a narrow, soot-coated tube. I climbed it now, the rungs cold through my gloves. I reached the top hatch, spun the locking wheel, and pushed. The hatch was heavy with ice, but it gave way. I pulled myself up onto the small grating platform at the very top of the ship, 80 feet above the waterline. The wind was a razor. It stripped the heat from my face instantly. I pulled my scarf up and squinted against the glare. The world was white and gray. Lake Superior was gone. In its place was a chaotic moonscape of jagged ice. Pressure ridges, some as high as houses, jutted up where the wind had smashed the floes together. The Iron Range was locked in a solid embrace, a black steel monolith rising from the frozen teeth of the lake.
I raised my binoculars. To the south, the shoreline of Marquette was a faint gray smudge. The massive concrete ore dock was still there, a tombstone for the industry. I scanned the ice between the ship and the shore. They were there. The statues. Dozens of them. They stood on the ice, frozen in mid-stride or mid-stumble. The extreme cold had caught them. They were not dead, or at least, the biology that drove them was just suspended. They were preserved. One figure stood only 50 yards from the ship's hull. It was a man in a red hunter's jacket. He was looking up at the ship, his arm raised as if hailing a cab. He was encased in a shell of clear rime ice, glittering in the weak winter sun. He had not moved in 3 weeks. I lowered the glasses. It was a graveyard that had not been buried. I looked at the ship itself. The ice had climbed the hull, thick, chaotic mounds piling up against the steel. It was crushing the plates, but the Iron Range was built for this. She was a Laker, built with high tensile steel to smash through winter navigation. She groaned under the pressure, deep metallic complaints that vibrated up through the stack. But she held. I checked the wind direction. North-northwest. Building. A storm was coming. I retreated back down the hatch, spinning the wheel to lock out the white silence. Survival needs a project. Maintenance is reactive. A project is proactive. It implies a future. My project was the radio. The bridge was inaccessible, or rather, the risk-to-reward ratio of entering the freezing accommodation block to reach it was too high. The captain was up there. And the cold. So I built my own comm station in the ECR. I had scavenged a handheld marine VHF radio from the emergency locker, but its range was line of sight, useless for anything beyond the horizon. I needed high frequency, HF. I needed to hear the world. I found an old single sideband SSB receiver in the electrician's workshop. It was a dusty, analog brick from the 80s, probably pulled from a lifeboat upgrade. The challenge was the antenna. An HF radio needs a long wire. The longer, the better. I could not go out on deck to string a dipole. Too dangerous. Too cold. So I used the ship. I took a spool of copper wire and ran it from the ECR up the ventilation shaft and clipped it to the massive steel handrail of the upper gallery. The entire rail system, isolated from the hull by rubber vibration dampers, became my antenna. It was electrically noisy, grounded poorly, and theoretically garbage. But it was big. I sat at the desk,
the radio powered by a 12-volt car battery I kept charged off the main bus. The room was lit only by the green glow of the dials. I put on the headphones. Static. It was not a sound. It was a texture, a wash of white grit that filled my head. I turned the tuning dial slowly. Scroll. Hiss. Scroll. Pop.
The atmospheric noise on the Great Lakes in winter is unique. The dry, cold air creates a clarity, a sharpness to the interference. 40 megahertz. Nothing. 70 megahertz. The ham bands. I spun the dial, filtering out the background noise. Repeat. My hand froze. It was a voice. Faint, buried under layers of ionospheric distortion, wavering like a ghost. I adjusted the squelch. I fine-tuned the frequency. Sector 4 remains compromised. All units hold at the perimeter. Do not engage. It was a loop. A recording. The voice was male, authoritative, military. But the cadence was wrong. It was skipping. Compromised. All units hold. Compromised. I listened for 10 minutes. It never changed. It was a digital ghost, a repeater station somewhere in Ohio or Wisconsin, running on emergency solar power, broadcasting a command that no one was left to hear. I kept spinning. 14 megahertz. Anyone reading this? This is station Kilo Echo 8. We have heat. We have secure. Please. Real time. A human voice. I grabbed the microphone. I keyed it. Station Kilo Echo 8. This is the vessel Iron Range. I read you. Over. I released the key. I waited. The static washed back in. If anyone is out there, the snow is covering the vents. We are running low on propane. Please. He had not heard me. My jury-rigged antenna could receive, but my transmission was getting grounded out by the massive steel hull of the ship. I was a black hole for radio waves. I could suck them in, but I could not escape. I listened to him for an hour. He was an old man, judging by the tremor in the voice. He was somewhere near Traverse City. He was talking about his wife. He was talking about the cold. Eventually, his signal faded into the night as the propagation shifted. I sat in the silence. I was not disappointed. In fact, a strange calm settled over me. They were out there. They were dying. They were cold. They were begging. I looked at the temperature gauge on the wall. 72 degrees. I looked at the coffee pot. Full. I looked at the light overhead. Steady. I was not trapped. I was fortified. The silence was not emptiness. It was security. The inventory of self. Weeks bled into months. The beard on my face grew thick and coarse. I stopped trimming it. It was insulation. I started talking to the ship more. Not crazy talk, technical talk. You're running rich on cylinder 6, I told the diesel as I checked the pyrometers. I'll back off the rack a millimeter. I adjusted the linkage. The engine note smoothed out. Better, I said. The ship answered in vibrations. I began to catalog the non-essential spaces. I needed to know what I had. I cut a hole in the welded door to the galley, just big enough to crawl through. I treated it like a spacewalk. I wore my heaviest layers, a respirator, and carried a pry bar. The galley was a freezer. The air was -10 degrees. Frost covered the stainless steel counters.
I scavenged. I found number 10 cans of tomato paste. I found 50 pounds of dried pasta. I found a hidden stash of chocolate bars in the cook's office. I dragged the loot back to the warm zone, sealing the hole behind me with a bolted steel plate. That night, I made pasta with red sauce. I melted the chocolate and dipped a stale cracker into it. It was the best meal I had ever eaten. The sugar rush made me dizzy. On day 60, the real storm hit. It was not just wind. It was a pressure drop so severe my ears popped. The sky turned a bruised, violent purple, and the snow came down like concrete. The wind hit 70 knots. The Iron Range is a heavy ship, but the ice sheet was a living thing. The wind pushed the ice, and the ice pushed the ship. I sat in the ECR, gripping the arms of my chair. The steel screamed. It was a high-pitched, torturous, shrieking sound as the hull plates compressed. The ship jolted. The list increased. 15 degrees became 17, then 18. Tools slid off the workbenches. The oil in the generator sump sloshed dangerously close to the cutoff point again. I ran to the engine. I stood by it for 12 hours, hand on the manual override lever, ready to catch it if it stalled.
"Hold it," I whispered. "Hold the line." The hull groaned. A deep, booming bass note like a cathedral bell struck underwater. I watched the bulkhead. If the plates buckled, the water would come in. If the water came in, the cold came in. But the rivets held. The welds held. American steel, forged in a different era, refused to yield to the Canadian wind. By morning, the wind died. The list settled at 19 degrees. It was steep. Walking was now an athletic event. But we were still dry. I climbed the stack to survey the damage. The ice landscape had changed. The pressure ridges were higher. The statues were gone, buried under 10 feet of fresh drift. The Red Jacket Man, the Ranger, the others, all erased by the whiteout. The ship was now the only feature in the landscape, a black fin rising from a white ocean. I felt a profound sense of ownership. This was not a wreck. This was my station. The acceptance. I stopped counting the days on the calendar. I stopped looking at the shore for rescue lights. I realized that the crisis phase was over. The adrenaline was gone, replaced by a crystalline clarity. I had work to do. I needed to rebuild the centrifuge feed pump. The bearings were getting noisy. I needed to fabricate a better heat exchanger for the potable water to save fuel. I needed to catalog the spare parts in the lower store. I sat at the ECR desk. The radio was on, hissing quietly, a companionable white noise. I opened the logbook. Day: unknown. Status: operational. Fuel: sufficient. Crew: 1. I put the pen down. I walked to the coffee maker. I poured a fresh cup. I did not spill a drop, my wrist automatically compensating for the 19-degree list. I looked at the main engine. The massive cylinder heads rocked gently in their rhythm. The turbocharger whined a high, thin note of power. The world outside had stopped. It was frozen, dead, and silent. But inside the Citadel, the pistons fired. Compression, ignition, power, exhaust. The heartbeat continued. I took a sip of coffee. It was hot. "Let's get to work," I said. I picked up my wrench and headed for the purifier room. The bearings would not fix themselves.